Welcome to Shelter in Solidarity, a deep dive with artists and activists during this COVID pandemic. Here we are over 7 months into this project, this critical education, this community building project, and we are headed into what looks like another spike in the COVID indicators, daily positive results, death tolls increasing once again, and it does seem that Shelter in Solidarity, this socially distanced solidarity project, will be with you for some time to come. The need seems to be enduring. Here we are 8 months into this pandemic. I'm Joe Ramsey, your host, Zooming, live streaming with you from Dorchester, Massachusetts, on the south side of Boston. And we are welcoming you here today for our very special show here on November 19th, Populism, Peril, or Promise. Populism, Peril, or Promise. And we are lucky today to have a tremendous guest joining us, Mike Lansing, about whom you will hear much more in a moment with the help of our co-producer and now co-host, I'm proud to say, my comrade, Mark Soderstrom. Mark, take it away. Mark is going to lead the discussion today. I'll just remind everyone who's on our live Zoom, obviously, that please keep your mic muted during the first part of the show when we're discussing with Mike Lansing. And about an hour in, as usual, we will open it up to live discussion, at which point we welcome your questions and comments. We do strive to build a community dialogue here at Shelter and Solidarity. Mark, take it away.
Thank you, Joe. I am pleased and honored for us to have the chance this evening to talk to my good friend and colleague, Michael Lansing, about some of these very important issues around populism and small d democracy, both in the present and in our past. Michael is a historian at Augsburg College in Minneapolis and has published on the history of the Nonpartisan League in the Upper Midwest and Pacific Northwest. And it is a real pleasure to invite him this evening. Michael, welcome to Shelter in Solidarity. Just to sort of open, Michael, I was wondering if you would be willing to sort of begin this evening with some of the scope of your observations around some of the key issues of populism and small d democracy in our present moment, particularly as we are moving, or hopefully moving, from a Trump regime to a Biden presidency. What are some of the issues that populism brings to the table?
Well, first of all, I just want to say how thankful I am to be here, and thanks to Joe and Mark and the producers for having me on and to talk about this super important topic, or at least I think it's important. You know, as I look at the landscape towards the end of November in 2020, and I look at the current situation and having these multiple and overlapping crises that we're facing, right? The virus obviously has laid bare precarity in our society in new ways. There's an economic crisis. We have a crisis of mass incarceration, racialized policing. We have an ongoing climate crisis and a host of other issues that we're facing. And the system, that is, the electoral system in the United States, produced the results that it produced. It produced Joe Biden in his late 70s, member of the US Senate for decades, former vice president. Many people are asking, is this the best the Democratic Party could come up with? And with that in mind, that I think that grassroots movements of nearly every sort need to be thinking about not just the power in the street, but also the power at the ballot box, because we often think about those two things as separated, when in fact they can be, and in the past have been, connected. And perhaps most importantly, right now, I would encourage anyone who's interested in participatory democracy or already engaged in the wide variety of movements for justice that one finds all over the country, whether they're local movements or whether you're part of a national movement, to be thinking about the election system. The system produced this outcome, a system that is flooded with corporate money, a system with party leaders largely in control at the state and at the federal level, a host of other issues. I would suggest that people who are engaged in grassroots movements need to be thinking about and pushing for, alongside all their other activities and all their other work, they need to be pushing for the public funding of political campaigns. They need to be pushing to abolish the Electoral College. They need to be thinking about pushing for statehood for Washington, D.C., as well as for Puerto Rico. Voter registration reform is needed in almost every state. And of course, the reinstatement of some key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court ruled problematic in 2013. The list just goes on and on. In other words, I think we need to work outside the system and inside the system. And by changing the system itself, more than changing a particular political party or even following a particular political candidate, could produce some very different outcomes in the future that could create more space for some more radical change.
Those are, wonderful sort of observations and ideas, and I think some folks would be surprised to hear those being touted as a populist platform at the moment, right? I mean, in certain respects, even my colleagues and my friends seem to listen to the New York Times and even public radio these days. And we're told over and over again that the country has made a populist turn by electing Trump, a billionaire, or a acclaimed billionaire, or Berlusconi in Europe, who really is a billionaire. And these people, we are told, are populists. And what you have described doesn't sound like their platform at all. It sounds a lot like the Populist Party, the Farmers Alliance, the Nonpartisan League. Could you walk us through a little bit about how a term that comes out of left-wing radical or reform political movements has evolved over time to become a shorthand for a right-wing politics of reaction and the wealthy? It's confusing for a lot of people, I think.
It's super confusing, and I would argue it's super problematic. And in fact, as a historian, I would argue that most of the time when I see the word populism used anywhere, in journalism, social media, even sometimes in scholarly work, I cringe a little bit. And I cringe a little bit because most of the time it's used in an ahistorical way. That is, that there is a complete lack of understanding and a misuse of the term as a category of analysis. So populism, as a word, literally is born in 1891, and it's used to describe the orientation of the People's Party, which is emerging at that point and will first run candidates at the federal level in 1892. And populism is associated with the aspiration for a multiracial economic democracy. Now, the People's Party of the 1890s was profoundly uneven as it aspired to that goal. It was profoundly uneven, in fact. But it's important to note that that is what populism is. Populism is meant to expand the notion of we the people. It was a variety of forms of working across different types of alliances between workers and farmers. In some cases, in the American South, there were even moments where you saw African-American populists working alongside white populists. And this is the 1890s, the moment when Jim Crow is ascending. And of course, there were hundreds of thousands of Black populists in a largely parallel movement. So this is a profoundly significant moment in American history, and the term populism is best used when we describe that moment. In the 1900s, early 1900s, 1920s, all the way into the 1930s, the term populism, it was largely associated with that very particular orientation. of, once again, an attempt or an aspiration for a multiracial economic democracy, as expressed not only in formal electoral politics, but in movement making, because of course there were a variety of movements that led to the creation of the People's Party as a formal third party in the 1890s. And when the Great Depression hits, there are a number of historians and scholars who were already by that point saying like, hey, here's an opportunity to try to imagine what populism might look like today. They would argue about whether or not Roosevelt's New Deal, in fact, embodied populism. That's an argument some would want to continue to have. But nonetheless, everyone seemed to understand what the word populism referred to. And it was still almost always used with a capital P. The shift, I would argue, in terms of where the confusion really begins is in the 1950s. It's in the era of Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, the Red Scare. It's in a moment when a number of liberal consensus intellectuals are deeply concerned about this problem that's emerging, that so many Americans across the country, so many regular Americans seem to be supporting this person in the US Senate who's clearly violating norms and destroying lives and calling out the original kind of call out culture, calling out any number of forms of behavior, making up charges, and seizing the attention of the nation. And in the context of the Red Scare, also in the context of the post-World War II moment, when there are deep-seated concerns about, well, what exactly went wrong in Germany? A number of social scientists and historians start to imagine populism, the 1890s version, as especially problematic, as a kind of proto-McCarthyism. Richard Hofstadter is the most famous person to do this work, but he's not the only one. A number of people in sociology and political science do it as well. And that's the moment when populism starts being used with a lowercase p. And that's the moment when suddenly people with right-wing demagoguery, fascism, racism, the opposite of the aspiration of the original populists, the aspiration to be inclusive across different types of identities, it's when that goes away. And suddenly the term populism reads almost as a synonym for demagoguery or nativism or a host of other forms of cancers on the body politic. And once that kind of is established in the 1950s, that's when you see this shift, when the word populism starts to be used and deployed by multiple kinds of people to be, defining all types of movements, but especially movements on the right, In the years since, historians have pushed back hard against Hofstadter's understanding of populism. There's a whole shelf full of books that one could point to, suggesting that his historical characterization of the populists in the 1890s was at best problematic. Nonetheless, I think what's really interesting is that this misuse of the term populism, taking it out of its historical context, using it to describe movements and leaders that are almost the exact opposite of what the People's Party stood for in the 1890s, very much defines its use today. So we can go, as you noted, to a newspaper, we can go online, we can read peer-reviewed scholarly work in a wide range of disciplines, and Bolsonaro is a populist in Brazil, and Le Pen is a populist in France, Boris Johnson is a populist, when in fact, none of those people stand for anything resembling economic democracy, let alone the other aspirations for systemic change that the People's Party and the original capital P populists stood for in the 1890s.
I'd be curious to know if you think that there's a struggle around the word. Is it worth trying to save the word and reclaim populism as a positive term? I mean, I've noticed that what has taken its place seems to be the word progressivism, which actually, as a historian, I have a problem with, because I associate progressivism exactly with that post-1950s efficiency. The experts will control and do right for other people, whereas populist seems to me to people doing it for themselves. Is there a value to trying to reclaim the term and the concept populism in your thought, or is it a lost cause at this point?
There are still some debates that I have with colleagues about this, colleagues who are deeply vested in the use of this word, and doing so in kind of what we would imagine as left of center circles. I actually think it's not much use to try to reclaim it. That's why I like to use the word small d democracy, or the phrase grassroots democracy, or talk about civic agency, talk about democracy as a form of everyday living, to use the John Dewey kind of formulation. I think in some ways it's crucial to connect this very particular tradition that's also very particular to the United States, to be frank, and to see that there are more connections between populism of the 1890s and say African American freedom movements in the 1960s than there are between, say, populism in the 1890s and Donald Trump and his followers in 2016 or 2020.
It's an important question, and sort of a vexed and a difficult one when words begin to change their meaning. How do you keep concepts alive? Joe, did you have something you would like to put in at this point as co-host?
Yeah, I do have a couple things here, that including a couple questions coming off the chat box that I'd like to flag. But first, I wanted to mention, first up, for those who don't know, Mike is the author of this really fascinating book I am just diving into, Insurgent Democracy. Great title, I hope we can talk about later. The Nonpartisan League in North American Politics. I'm sure many people on this call, despite being very involved in left politics, may have never even heard of the Nonpartisan League. So I'm looking forward to getting into that discussion. But what I wanted to see if I could, Mike, with your permission, ask you to respond to another book engaging populism and its changing meaning over time, its appropriation, and particularly not only populism as it's been misunderstood in more recent times, and as that term has been appropriated by right-wing ideologues, demagogues, such as Donald Trump. I wondered if you could, if you might be interested in commenting on Thomas Frank's recent book, The People Know. I have it in my other hand here. And his book seems as concerned with reclaiming, or at least reminding folks about what populism once meant, but also in zooming in on anti-populism, right? I mean, of course, Frank having a long kind of standing critique of the tendencies within the Democratic Party and the kind of abandonment of any notion of working class solidarity. I just wanted to read a brief couple sentences from Frank here to get your response to it. And then maybe next time Mark calls on me, we'll flag some questions in the chat and bring them in a little earlier. But Frank writes kind of towards the end of his opening in The People Know, right? The people as in no, not the people. That's scary, right, to anti-populist. He says, "It is my argument that reversing the meaning of populist tells us something important about the people who reversed it. Denunciations of populism, like the ones we hear so frequently nowadays, arise from a long tradition of pessimism about popular sovereignty and democratic participation. And it is that pessimism, that tradition of quasi-aristocratic scorn, that has allowed the paranoid right to flower so abundantly." I mean, I wonder if you might make a comment on anti-populism as a part, or anti-quote unquote populism as a part of this mix, kind of almost defining the term negatively, and also just respond to kind of Frank's book. I know you're familiar with what he's written, and of course, his books make a big splash in some circles and maybe don't reach others, but kind of curious how you position yourself in relationship to Frank's notion of populism and anti-populism.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to Frank's orientation and argument there, to be completely honest. He's been using essentially that critique of neoliberalism since the late 1990s, or even before that, when he's helped start the Baffler. And Frank, in this book, I think, has come to a kind of culmination and laid out, or tried to lay out, a particular trajectory, as well as to reclaim the term populist. Our leading historian of the 1890s People's Party, Charles Fussell, has done the same in outlets like Jacobin and Dissent, basically saying, no, you got it all wrong. That's not what this means. And I think that's important work. That's important work. I do think that that argument and that debate can take up a lot of the oxygen in the room, when in fact we should be talking about civic agency and everyday democracy, which is a deep-seated and long-standing tradition in American life that has involved and encompassed nearly every type of American one can imagine. In other words, you've seen expressions of it, not just with mostly ethnically white farmers, but in nearly every group of Americans, actually trying to put the we back into we the people. And at the same time, as Frank points out, there's a long history of certain Americans not wanting that to happen. And I think we need to call it out. If anything, one of the flaws with Frank's book is that he starts in the 1890s, that he starts with the People's Party. And if we get stuck with this category of, and this term populism, we don't see the ways in which elites have actually tried to limit democracy, going very back to the founding of the country. And there are lots of different ways around racial and gender identity, most obviously and most acutely when we think about the 1780s and we think about who's deciding what it even means to be a citizen and who gets to have that kind of ability and access to be a citizen. We see it in the Constitution, the so-called 3/5 clause, right? Actually, we have to understand the Constitution itself as a counter-revolutionary document. We have to understand that the Constitution was set up to protect government from the people. James Madison talks about that directly. One of the most important books written by historians about the Constitutional Convention is called The Founders' Coup. The Articles of Confederation clearly wasn't working very well, but the group that gathered in Philadelphia, not only did they meet in closed session in 1787, but they met without any type of authority to completely throw out what was existing and to start over and to start anew. The great irony about the Constitution is that it begins with that clause, we the people. And of course, different types of groups of Americans have been leveraging the heck out of that phrase ever since, and with some effect. We've come some ways, even though we have some ways to go, obviously. But I think that anti-populism is actually anti-democracy. And I think that it has existed since the beginning of the Republic, that the Republic itself is founded on it. And I think that we cannot understand this moment if we do not understand that. In other words, why do we have this electoral college? Why is it that the last two GOP presidents came into office with a minority of the popular vote? It's because the system was producing that. The system is built to produce it. And that's even before the 1890s, the system is set up that way. At the same time, the Constitution has the seeds of its own new possibilities as movements for abolition, women's rights, and a host of others from the early 19th century on have laid claim to. So I'm very sympathetic to Frank. I like a lot of what he says. I love how he pieces together this tradition from the 1890s to the present and tries to draw a through line. I actually think he should have talked a little more about the Popular Front in the late 1930s. I think he should have talked about the Wallace campaign for the presidency in 1948. I was stunned to see that that was not mentioned at all. But so far, it's the best, I would argue, it's the best kind of synthesis we have of laying out this much longer trajectory in American political, social, and economic life.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, I think really interesting points about the limits of the book as well as its strengths. I appreciate that. One thing I was struck by, and just kind of perusing the book again, just kind of going through my notes, right before tonight's discussion, is the way in which Frank kind of makes an interesting argument about how at least like the left, parts of the left in the United States, at least kind of post 1960s, seem to have framed, he argues, their kind of alternative radical agenda in opposition to a notion of the people, the American people, which has in fact been framed right through this pseudo-populism that makes the American people look more backward and reactionary than they in fact are. And so, I mean, I think this idea, this a notion of reclaiming even the American people as a we rather than as a they, against which, the true radicals must kind of, take the position of denouncing, right? Put, I think he quotes Jefferson Airplane, right? Is like, put the motherfuckers against the wall or whatever. I mean, it's kind of like a weather, the kind of weather underground kind of tendency of like, don't be like Mao and, serve the people shit, right? This idea that the American people themselves are so compromised right, politically by whatever racism, imperialism, et cetera, that we shouldn't be, whoever the left as a we shouldn't actually be identifying with America at all. I mean, that's more of a comment than a question, but I wondered if you might, reflect on it. And I guess related to that, I actually like to call up Victor Wallace's question from the chat box. Didn't Tom Watson, a populist leader, right, important populist leader, flip from his multiracial approach in the 1890s and kind of become an emblem of white supremacy in a way? And also, we had a question also related from Jasmine Collins in the chat books about whether or not the term populism had appeared outside the United States early in the 19th century. A bit of a, just want to flag that. But I mean, I'm just kind of interested in this. I mean, is there do you see a danger that in the way that the kind of appropriation of populism and of the American people has in fact become internalized on the left to the point that people envision politics not as a kind of democratic struggle with actually existing people, but as, I don't know, some kind of anti-populist project?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain strains of the left that clearly articulate that, and what I think are problematic ways. I mean, people who study civic agency, people who study grassroots democracy, make it very clear, whether they're political scientists or sociologists or community organizers, actually doing the work on the ground, union organizers, they always talk about how you have to build relationships across difference, right? That you are building relationships across difference. The old Alinsky idea that you're building relationships across difference based on shared self-interest. I think if that's yoked to particular forms of, well, to particular political goals, as well as particular political projects, it can be a very, very powerful thing. And I think that the left overlooks that possibility at its own peril. It's very easy in politics generally to become a purist. And I think that it's possible to engage in work across difference around justice questions of many and varied sorts, and to hold straight up, to hold on to your very specific ideas, but to be able to find common ground to work with others that don't have your exact same ideologies. And we have a long tradition of doing that in the United States. The People's Party is one example. I would argue African American freedom movements are another example. And we learn a great deal when we start thinking about Black freedom movements in the post-World War II period as a form of people power, as a form of we the people politics. So for instance, one of my heroes, the great Ella Baker, maybe one of the best organizers ever in the history of the United States, she would always say that strong people don't need strong leaders, right? She would always try to encourage people to listen to each other, for them to articulate their own problems and then to articulate their own solutions together. And she, of course, had experiences in cooperative movements, African-American cooperative movements in the early 1930s. She had experience rubbing shoulders with members of the CP as well as CIO organizers, along with the longstanding freedom movement work that she had been a part of since she was a young woman. And I think that there's actually a generational thing that you see. People who came out of the CIO experience or the Popular Front experience, they understood coalition building in a way that the new left found harder to fulfill, which is actually one of the things that Frank points out in his book, and I think he's right about that. In terms of Tom Watson, absolutely Tom Watson flips. That's why I was careful to say that the People's Party in the 1890s aspired to be a multiracial economic democracy. Our best book on Black populism by Omar Ali suggests that essentially, for various reasons defined by African Americans in the South themselves, they organized separately, but then would sometimes engage in fusion politics with white populists across the South. And it's important to remember that there are hundreds of thousands of Black populists in the 1890s, that it is a very powerful element of African American movement traditions as well.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's a lot to think about. And Joe was very kind to sort of pick up and show your book to everyone. Theoretical questions become clearer when you've got also some content and historical context. So You published specifically on the history of the Nonpartisan League in the Upper Midwest, the Northern Rockies, Pacific Northwest. This is a movement that's really mostly left our historical memory and consciousness, and yet it was incredibly involved in reform and radical politics. It's at the root of universal healthcare in Canada, and yet somehow we often don't remember it. I'm wondering if you could bring some of that history to folks here and give a little frame to your historical work and how it relates to the issues you've just been talking about.
Absolutely. So, so my book is about one of these, one of the movements in this tradition, and one of the movements in this tradition that happens after the People's Party of the 1890s. Now, it still involves farmers, and it still involves farmers in the Trans-Mississippi West. And I have to be frank, I did not plan on writing a book about mostly white dead farmers. Nothing sexy about that. We live in an urban time. We think about rural America in particular ways. I know we're going to hopefully talk about that later on. There's nothing sexy on the surface about this farmer movement from the upper Midwest. Starts in North Dakota, of all places, in the middle of the 19-teens. And yet, in the early 2000s, when we were confronting endless war, we were confronting so many of the problems that we were facing now, and of course, the 2008 economic crisis. I looked around, I was like, wow, how do I mean, I'd been studying social movements as a historian for years. I'd done all this reading, but I actually didn't know how they worked, like how one could do that work, right? I was stuck in the kind of ivory tower. And so I turned to, I live in Minneapolis, lived in the Twin Cities a long time, and I turned to a local example, and I started unpacking the ways in which we might think about how to deal with climate change, and how we might think about how to deal with mass incarceration and embedded structural racism. And because what I figured out is you actually have to engage in politics of every sort to do that kind of work. And engagement in politics means better understanding even electoral politics. So suddenly I became a kind of historian of politics and started looking at this farmers movement. So it's a movement made up of farmers. It's born in North Dakota in 1915. Essentially, you have North and South Dakota, Western Minnesota, Eastern Montana as a hinterland of Minneapolis as an urban center. It's a wheat growing hinterland. And of course, remember that Minneapolis in the 1880s becomes the center of flour milling in the world. It's where industrial carbohydrates are essentially born. There have been flour milling as a feature of settler culture and European culture for thousands and thousands of years, but at the scale of factory and large numbers of wage laborers and machinery. That was invented in Minneapolis in the 1880s, and it was entirely dependent on these rural areas growing wheat. And essentially, the economic game was rigged. The farmers knew that. Populism, the capital P populist of the 1890s, had not been able to fix the problems that these particular farmers faced. And so in the early 1900s, they start engaging in small scale and then large scale cooperative organizing. And cooperative organizing gets them so far, but they realize that they actually have to engage the levers of government. And so in 1916, this new organization, it's not a party, it's a membership-based political organization, the Nonpartisan League. And by the way, very clearly, nonpartisan, deliberately, by design, starts running candidates for statewide offices in North Dakota. By 1918, they'll have taken over that state's government. They'll be spreading to 12 other states. They actually also start organizing in Saskatchewan and Alberta, which is also a kind of wheat hinterland of Winnipeg, which is a secondary market of Minneapolis. And this notion of a nonpartisan league takes off. It's a membership-based political organization. It takes advantage of this new expansion of democratic structures, like the ones I started out talking about. The open primary, which was a new innovation in the early 1900s. And that creation of an open primary actually allowed for this idea to work. Essentially, what you do is you take a membership-based organization, you build it around a platform rather than people. And in this case, the platform was about reducing the economic power of the Minneapolis milling industry. and transportation interests. And so they wanted a state-owned grain elevator and a state-owned flour mill in North Dakota. They also wanted a state-owned bank. All three of which were eventually established, by the way, in 1921, all three of which are still in operation, celebrating their 100th anniversaries this year and next. And these folks are not socialists. There were a number of socialists who were involved in the creation of this nonpartisan organization, but it also brought in Republicans and even the few Democrats that could be found on the Northern Plains at the time. And by focusing on a particular platform, you brought farmers together across a wide range of difference. And this is really important because North Dakota we think of today as the heart of whiteness. North Dakota in 1910 has more foreign-born residents than any other state in the country. And they are not just ethnically different from each other, they're practicing different religions. There are a number of small pockets of Syrian immigrants who are practicing Islam in North Dakota. Some argue that the first mosque in the United States was created in North Dakota in the 1930s, in the little town of Ross. There are lots of different types of ways in which these people could not get together. And yet this focus on a platform and not a candidate, this focus on a particular set of things we want to do is what leads the Nonpartisan League into the halls of power in North Dakota and allows them to establish these state industries. In some ways, this idea is really about taking cooperation, and by cooperation, I mean the cooperative movement, like what you might do with your grocery co-op, and using that same idea and taking it into electoral politics, right? It's not an accident that they had been deeply involved in cooperative movements of their own making before they create this nonpartisan league. But in the book, not only do I track its expansion across different parts of the Trans-Mississippi West and into the Prairie Provinces in Canada, but I suggest that in some ways it's the most successful agrarian movement in US history. After all, these state industries persist in North Dakota, which we think of, once again, as a very red state. It's probably the biggest challenge to party politics as usual in US history. And I would argue also that finally the League invented strategies and tactics for electoral politics that are too often overlooked today. And the reason they're often overlooked, the reason many of us have never heard of this movement, the reason that even though I had grown up in this region, completely misunderstood what all this was about, even as a trained historian before I started my research for this book, is because it happened in North Dakota, right? Who thinks of innovation as something that emanates from North Dakota? I mean, innovation in anything, let alone in politics, especially the way we're conditioned to imagine rural America today. So the League takes power in the late 19-teens. By the early 1920s, its statewide officials are recalled by the voters of North Dakota. The recall, another structural reform that the League had put in place to further democratize the system. One piece of the League actually ends up becoming a wing of the Republican Party in North Dakota, and that tradition continues in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It actually joins with the Democratic Party in North Dakota. And it becomes, even today, if you go to North Dakota, the Democratic Party there is called the DNPL. It's also important to note that the nonpartisan thing was for real. In Minnesota, of course, the Nonpartisan League took off and became eventually the farmer wing of the Farmer Labor Party of the 1930s, mostly working inside the Republican Party in Minnesota. In Montana and in Colorado and in Idaho, the Nonpartisan League worked mostly in the Democratic Party. And in fact, in Idaho, the Nonpartisan League became so powerful that in 1918, the state legislature voted to end the open primary, to go back to the kind of party bosses and conventions and smoke-filled rooms. They literally withdrew democracy from the people because the League was proving to be such a challenge to both established parties. So this notion of nonpartisanship and this commitment to a platform over a candidate produced all kinds of flexibility. And finally, they focused on local and state level races. There's not this approach of trying to take the presidency that you see in the People's Party in the 1890s. This is one of the lessons of the 1890s. They're like, look, third party politics doesn't work. And they're like, furthermore, we can affect the change we need at the local and state level. I'll stop there.
Well, we've had some questions in the chat box, which I think are telling, right? And folks would like you to actually confirm that yes, these institutions, the grain elevator, the bank, are celebrating their 100th anniversary, but are they still state-owned? And
Yes, absolutely they are. And it's amazing when you think about it, right? Because the last statewide Democrat to hold office in North Dakota was Heidi Heitkamp, excuse me, the senator, who of course lost re-election in 2018. And the Democratic Party in North Dakota is on its heels right now. But whether they were Republicans or Democrats, for the last 100 years in North Dakota politics, the state industries, the state bank, the state grain elevator, and the state flour mill, which PS makes products that I can buy in my local grocery store, and I do, by the way. They are like the third rail of North Dakota politics. Nobody touches them. Nobody touches them. North Dakota has benefited greatly from a state bank, as well as from state-owned industries that are at the center in some ways, not just of their agricultural tradition, but of their agricultural economy today.
yeah, there are a lot of public banking advocates who use North Dakota as a model and as a reason why public banking would be so important for cities like Oakland or California. Their public bank movement has spent a lot of time looking at North Dakota. I sent some of their public banking movement your book because I thought they needed to read it. It's still a fascinating thing that it's hard for people to wrap their head around, that North Dakota is the center of state-owned industries. And you started talking about some of the lessons of nonpartisan. I'm wondering if you would sort of apply that directly to some of the issues at the moment. You know, we've seen the rise of the Sanders campaign, sort of heralding some new moves in the Democratic Party. We've seen dramatic growth in the Democratic Socialists over the last decade, and they're sort of struggling with, do we continue to work inside the Democratic Party? Do we try, there are people who are talking about reform or establishing third parties at the moment. What historical lessons would you draw from your work for those people who are talking about those questions of reform or third party politics at the moment?
Well, first of all, I think that generally there's a consensus that third parties are either too easily co-opted or can't produce pluralities that can win elections. And there are plenty of exceptions to that rule in plenty of parts of the country, but mostly at the local level. Progressive Party in Wisconsin, Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota in the 1930s, which actually, as Mark pointed out in an earlier conversation, was the second party, not the third party. It was really acting as the second party in the landscape at that time in the state of Minnesota. I've been watching, like all of you, I've been watching video casts and listening to podcasts and listening to a range of people and thinkers and workers and organizers on the left talk about different electoral political options, and this third party idea keeps coming up. And I have to admit, I wince a little bit. I think that this notion of a membership-based political organization is one that has a lot more potential than anyone has given it credit for. And that's in part because it's not just premised on every 2 years or every 4 years at the ballot box. It's not just a mobilization, it's actually about organizing. So in the late 19-teens, what leaguers do is they actually pay organizers to go out and to sign up people as members. And what you get as a member in 1915, if you join the Nonpartisan League, is a newspaper. You also get the right to participate in caucuses, primary meetings, essentially town hall meetings. And you get the right, you get a card, literally a membership card, and you get to help determine the platform and identify candidates. And you can identify a candidate who's a socialist or a Democrat or a Republican, doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not they adhere to your program. If they adhere to your program, then you say, well, we're going to deliver our block of votes. You're our person. You're the person we endorse. If they choose to renege on that, you vote them out next time. That organizing in all the months between every 2 or 4 years is what made the Nonpartisan League so distinctive. You can go to parts of North Dakota today and people still talk about the League. We're talking about organizing that happened over 100 years ago. In 2016, I spoke at the luncheon of the Democratic Nonpartisan League State Convention in Bismarck, North Dakota, because the book had just come out. And these were mostly, it was a mix of kind of what are stereotypically called prairie populists with some nostalgia for this earlier time of a more radical democratic approach. And then younger folks in their 20s and 30s who are profoundly anti-racist and trying to undo discrimination against queer people and trying to think about how to have a better society in ways that might be more familiar to the DSA members who are on the call. And when I finished speaking, I got some questions, and then everyone in the room stood up and yelled, "We'll stick, we'll win." And it blew my mind, because that was the motto of the League in the late 19-teens. These people's grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents had been organized into the League. They weren't mobilized for elections, they were organized into a cohesive bloc. And that persisted through generations. That shows the power of organizing over mobilizing, and it shows the power of thinking about long-term organizing and the work you kind of do in the streets in the 2020 context, and connecting that directly to the ballot box. And this notion of cooperation, which so many on the left are familiar with, and we can critique it and we can talk about different models, producer co-ops or consumer co-ops or union-owned co-ops, right? Worker-owned cooperatives. We can talk about all the structures and models, but what if we took that idea, which we're already familiar with? What if we take all the great innovation happening in Jackson, Mississippi right now? What if we take that and literally import it into electoral politics through cooperative political action? That's what the Nonpartisan League story can teach us about.
So Mike, you may have just preempted this question, but I wanted to ask you about the title of your book, which seems kind of relevant at this moment as well in the conversation. Insurgent Democracy. I mean, I think it's a striking title. It's really, and partly it's striking because it kind of seems to put two concepts together that maybe, exist often separately in kind of the kind of dominant common sense of like American politics. Insurgents, we think of kind of like armed rebels or something elsewhere, right? Rising up, insurgency, insurrection, and democracy. I mean, I guess my question here is, what made the democracy of the Nonpartisan League and its associated movements insurgent, would you say? Yeah, how would you define that?
Yeah, other scholars refer to this as radical democracy. And radical here, once again, going back to Ella Baker, meaning radical not in terms of a commitment to a particular ideology, but radical meaning to go to the root, as Baker used to say. What does it mean to go to the root? What does it mean to transform the whole human being, right? And not just get somebody to show up for a protest, not just get somebody to show up for an election. So when you put together insurgent and democracy, you're actually challenging some of the stuff that your earlier questions touched on. In this country, even, in fact, sometimes especially on the left, but certainly in general, democracy is understood to be a noun, right? It's a thing. I wanted to talk about democracy as a verb, as something that you do, as John Dewey once said, as an everyday activity. That's what makes democracy insurgent, is the civic agency tradition in American life, right? It's about being committed to democracy every day in every way around questions of economics and sexuality and race and ethnicity, national origin. How do we make democracy part of everyday life? And when you do that, you're being insurgent because you're pushing back against this idea of democracy being a noun, of democracy being an institution, a deeply flawed one. Everybody on this call could talk about the flaws of our current democracy and what's not so democratic about it, because the list is pretty long. So insurgency matched up with this notion of democracy as a verb. That's where I was headed. That's what I was trying to get at. Because what I saw in these farmers, and you see this in multiple examples back deep into the early 19th century and all the way up into the 21st century, what you see is people who are committed to each other around shared self-interest and across difference, transforming themselves and transforming the world around them. And those kinds of radical, deep transformations, I would argue, are an insurgency against the status quo and against a bunch of assumptions that all of us carry around, and a host of other things.
Thanks, Mike.
Your story of "will stick, will win" just plucks at the heart and brings tears to my eyes in terms of thinking about, you know, the political lessons and the passage of generations. And I think, but there are also, I think, some economic lessons that we want to draw out here in terms of the application of politics to economics. And I read your book, and I'm listening to the rhetoric of these farmers talking about, you know, the power of finance, the power of the banks, the breaking the monopolies. And it reminds me that in certain ways, it's a fairly middle-class movement, right? You have to have a mortgage to critique the bank, right? Traditionally, working class struggles have been point of production. There's not that, workers don't have that many arguments with banks traditionally. Farmers do. But the rhetoric sounds so eerily similar to, you know, the rhetoric of Occupy that begin to critique, again, the power of monopoly, the power of banks, the power of finance, the power of the 1%. What are some of the lessons that we might draw from the Nonpartisan League to thinking forward about new kinds of coalitions that move beyond sort of consumptive politics or point of production politics to envision sort of new terrains of economic struggle politically?
Well, I think that outside of certain circles, until the last 5 to 8 years, it's been much easier for people to think through and talk about questions of race and gender, as much as those are themselves struggles, than it has been about class. Right? That's one of the important experiences of our moment, the last decade, is that class in some ways is back on the radar. And if you were part of a union, of course, it never went away. But I think for the broader political conversation, it's roared back. And I think one of the reasons it's roared back is exactly what you point to, Mark. It's the emergence of Occupy. I was actually drafting this book when Occupy went down. And I was watching the news and, you know, watching Democracy Now! And like listening to the radio and trying to sort out like what is going on. And I think that you make a significant point when you suggest that the middle class, in many ways, has some piece, is a piece of the puzzle here. Because what my book does is actually build on some other scholarship. Dear friend and colleague Robert Johnston at the University of Illinois at Chicago wrote a book many years ago called The Radical Middle Class. Talk about insurgent and democracy as two things you don't necessarily think paired together. The radical middle class, the petite, you know, bourgeoisie, like radical. What was this person talking about? And what he does is lay out the ways in which the lower middle class, in particular, has been, in many cases, at the center, animating certain movements for small d democracy in American life. In the 19th century, that's largely small property holders, right? As you note, farmers who can't even get a mortgage, you know, don't even necessarily have a grievance because they don't even have that to kind of leverage to move into making change. I think that it's important to understand that the ways in which it is possible to build coalitions between today's version of a middle class. You think about the work that's happening right now. I'm seeing it on left social media, calls for the Biden administration to abolish student debt. And now people are starting to talk about how the Biden administration could abolish medical debt, right? Kind of a very abbreviated, bounded jubilee, right? I wasn't sure I would ever live to even see such a conversation exist outside of certain circles. But it's because the middle class is so profoundly squeezed. And we know that the middle class is appealed to. We know that the middle class is this prop that's used by politicians. And we know that Americans themselves don't even fully understand what it means to be middle class. Like people who make $30,000 a year will call themselves middle class, and people who make $300,000 a year will call themselves middle class. These questions of definition remain problematic. Nonetheless, there seems to be real potentiality in a politics that binds together working class and especially lower middle class people. And maybe that's not true in the 1950s or 1960s because there was still a slightly more equitable distribution of wealth. But as we've seen this concentration of wealth become more and more concentrated over the last 20 years, maybe this is a politics that needs to be very intentionally turned to. And this notion of the 99%, if middle class people can be turned on to working class forms of organizing, could be very constructive, because you can build these coalitions that then have some serious electoral sway. And the Nonpartisan League shows that. In different states, the Nonpartisan League reached out to organized labor. And where they were successful in doing so, they had a lot more electoral success. Places like Minnesota and Montana in particular, very, very healthy left culture in Montana in the early 1900s. Wobblies, union organizing, mostly in the industrial extraction, largely in Butte, Montana, one of the largest mining centers of the world at the time. So you had people who were devoted to very radical working class politics who were willing to work alongside these small property farmers. Small property farmers who, by the way, rejected the unionization of migrant agricultural workers, right? Like, we're not going to let them off the hook. The migrant agricultural workers of the 19 teens and 1920s were largely Western and Northern European immigrants, with some Southern and Eastern European immigrants thrown in on the Great Plains. And the Wobblies organized them in the Agricultural Workers Organization in the middle of the 19 teens, and the Nonpartisan League farmers voted down when its own leadership tried to create a direct collaboration. The Leaguer membership voted it down. Nonetheless, in Minnesota, very clear connections to organized labor in St. Paul in particular. It was proved to be very productive. That's what sets up the Farmer Labor Party for success in the 1930s. And then in Montana, they have some local success in elections because they make that bridge. So I think there's a real possibility here. There are perils and pitfalls, but real possibilities in bringing together the long-standing, well-known, largely well-understood working class radical tradition in organizing and in mobilizing and in politics, and this much lesser well-known, yet nonetheless robust tradition of especially lower middle class organizing and commitments to a wide range of democracies, not just political democracy, but economic democracy too. Robert Johnson famously called the lower middle class capitalists against capitalism. That's what I call these farmers in the book, which once again, like, explodes our assumptions. Wait, how can you be a capitalist and be against capitalism? There are multiple varieties of capitalism extant at any given time, right? So then it's important to understand, well, they're against monopolies, right? Why do you have these small property owners creating state-owned industries? It's not because they're socialists. They actually reject socialism. There's a small group of socialists in North Dakota in the 19 teens. They can't get any traction. They're talking about collectivization, and farmers are like, yeah, whatever, I'm trying to grow wheat and make a buck. Like, come on, right? But state-owned industry, state-owned bank, state-owned grain elevator, these farmers are down because it helps them protect their own small property from the monopoly interests, in this case, based in Minneapolis, and to a lesser extent, Chicago. So there are real possibilities there. It's ground that's worth exploring. How's that?
You brought a lot to the table that's particularly exciting, and we are we're setting up for a rich conversation, I am sure, and I hope. We are approaching 8, and we did want to take the moment. We have you here from Minneapolis. You live a mile from the 3rd precinct, which was the police precinct that burned. And I know that you have written some on policing, racialized policing in Minneapolis and its history. And I feel it would be remiss if we didn't have you comment a little bit on what is a very pressing issue at the moment and of great concern to a large portion of the membership of Shelter in Solidarity. I think all of us in Shelter in Solidarity are paying attention to what's going on in Minneapolis. And would you unpack a little bit of the historical narrative that you've been working on and what's going on in Minneapolis at the moment?
Sure, I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. I could go on for an hour about that just because it's so complicated.
Well, I think we
Essentially,
should have you back another time for a full on that, perhaps, if it works out when these things come to a head. Please.
yeah. So the story of racialized policing in Minneapolis is both distinct from and exactly alike or akin to the story of racialized policing in most of America's other major urban centers, right? We know the origins of policing are protecting the status quo, protecting property, whether that's actual capital or real estate or whiteness as a form of property. We know that, of course, the police were also used by any number of corporate forces to reduce the power of organized labor. All that is true in Minneapolis. Minneapolis was a notoriously anti-union town until Trotskyites in a Teamsters union broke the back of the anti-union organizing in Minneapolis in 1934 with a what turned out to be a rather violent strike. One of the two biggest strikes of that year, along with the San Francisco strikes. So all that is true in Minneapolis, and yet there's a very specific story to the Minneapolis police as well, especially in its relationship with communities of color. And that is that the Great Migration that brought so many African Americans from the rural South to the urban West and to the urban North came late to Minneapolis. There are African Americans in Minneapolis from the very beginning. They're very small in terms of demographic proportion. Prince's family comes up from Louisiana in the 1920s. He came from a multi-generational Minneapolis African-American family, for instance. But it's really not until after World War II that you see a significant migration of Black folks to Minneapolis. And it's between 1950 and 1960 that those numbers grow almost exponentially. African-American civil rights organizations in Minneapolis were fighting around questions of employment and employment discrimination, and especially housing discrimination. Policing does not really become a big part of the puzzle until the 1960s for Black freedom movement organizations. But one of the reasons it does is because of intense housing segregation and an inability of Black folks to move up and out into other parts of the Twin Cities. That in combination with racist policing proves to be very potent. A lot of that racist policing comes through the political power of the police union. Here in Minneapolis, we have a weak mayor system. And in the late 1950s and early 1960s, according to this research I've just been doing in the last few months, the police union enters into politics, city politics, municipal politics as a major player by the early 1960s, which is the exact moment when racial tensions around policing and racialized policing are emerging. By 1969, the president of the Minneapolis Police Union becomes mayor of the city of Minneapolis, a man named Charles Stenvig. Stenvig is serving a 2-year term. The police union is not actually even a bargaining union yet. That doesn't happen until 1972. Stenvig is reelected on a platform of, he's a Scandinavian American, he's a police lieutenant, union leader, definitely reaches out to the white working class in Minneapolis, pulls their support. He's running as an independent. In 1971, he runs for reelection, and I think this is actually more telling. He wins even more handily, and he defeats the most important African-American civil rights leader in Minneapolis, who has the backing of the Democratic Party and major corporate leaders and the city's major newspaper. So that's a moment when police union municipal power is institutionalized in Minneapolis, and it leads to a situation in the 1980s and 1990s and into the early 2000s where time after time after time, young men and young women of color are murdered on the streets by the Minneapolis police, where police brutality is a part of everyday life in communities of color. Remember, the American Indian movement starts in Minneapolis in 1968, largely because of Native people trying to sort out how to engage in their own indigenous controlled civilian patrols because of the police brutality that is focused on people of color. By 1985, there's an editorial in the Minneapolis paper that says, who runs the police department? Is it the mayor and the chief, or is it the police union? And of course, here in 2015, we saw the murder of Jamar Clark by Minneapolis police. There was a lot of local organizing, Black Lives Matter movement organizing, as well as other organizing. And that's why things unfolded the way that they did this summer. There's a long foundation of both of injustice and of responses to injustice in Minneapolis communities of color because of this long history and trajectory.
Thanks for that, Mike. I mean, I'm sure we could, and it sounds like based on your summary there of that history, that we should get deeper into the policing and the racialization, racialized policing question, and from your Minneapolis perspective. But before we go there, and maybe we'll go there tonight as well, a little more with the help of our audience. We actually have a special musical interlude queued up. It's actually, in some sense, it's a shout out to Mike Lansing and his work in the Midwestern radicalism here, as well as to Mark Soderstrom, who in fact performed this song for us. Hayseed Like Me from performed by Mark Soderstrom.
I once was a tool of oppression, just as blind as a sucker could be. The monopolies banded together just to beat a poor hayseed like me. Oh, to beat a poor hayseed like me, boys, to beat a poor hayseed like me. The monopolies banded together just to beat a poor hayseed like me. And old party bosses together did sweetly agree. Well, they thought it would be little trouble when working a hayseed like me. When working a hayseed like me, boys, and working a hayseed like me. Well, they thought it would be little trouble when working a hayseed like me. I see, and the ticket we vote next November will be made up of hayseeds like me. Be made up of hayseeds like me, boys, be made up of hayseeds like me. And the ticket we vote next November will be made up of hayseeds like me.
Woohoo! Yeah, Mark. I had never heard Mark Soderstrom sing until that moment. Despite having been at, I don't know, 10 radical Marxist conferences with you, Mark, over the country, and we met through the Marxist Literary Group, a very active group still, but it reminds me, hearing you sing and never having heard you sing before, despite having been in so many leftist movement sympathetic building spaces, makes me wonder, where is the singing on the left today? You know, plenty of music that has political themes, but I mean, I think, was it Kenneth Burke, the sometime communist cultural and rhetorical analyst, who said, if you can find out what people will sing about, then you've learned a little bit about what they're willing to fight for. Anyway, beautifully sung, Mark. And I think the fact, I think anytime a movement is filled with song and imbued with song, there's something to pay attention to there, right? That something serious. Chanting's good, singing's better. I'm just going on the record right there. Well, we're not asking you to sing, folks, live audience members, although we're not precluding it either. If you feel inspired by Mark's example, thanks to Seren Mouliar also for putting that great video together. Really appreciate that. Seren does so much of the behind the scenes work. Speaking of little business related to the show, we want to remind people at this hour mark that we will be having our next show in 2 weeks on December 3rd. We have a show on arts and resistance. We'll be bringing back 2 Shelter and Solidarity featured guests of the past and perhaps a couple of other artists as well. We'll have Demetrius Noble, the very accomplished slam poet, been featured in The Intercept, and a great friend and comrade of mine, as well as Raymond Nat Turner, a great comrade and poet from the West Coast. We'll have an East Coast, a North Carolina to California lineup, and some visual artists, and maybe a little more music too in 2 weeks as we move towards wrapping up this everlasting 2020. So make sure to stay tuned or come back in 2 weeks. Don't leave now either, but in 2 weeks we'll have you back, we hope. And we also, I might as well take this moment to mention, we have a YouTube channel, Shelter and Solidarity, which we ask you to subscribe to and to follow so you don't miss an episode. We have over 30 episodes from the work of the last 7 months we've done together. And we are all volunteer effort. We ask you to help support the effort in whatever way you can, sharing the footage with your network and giving us feedback on it as well. We're always seeking to improve here. If you'd like to get more involved, reach out to us. We're shelterandsolidarity.org, shelterandsolidarity.org, and you can find us on YouTube and Facebook under the same name. All right, let's have a discussion. We always want to have a community discussion here in Shelter and Solidarity. There's too many programs that just throw content at folks without any ability to process it. How democratic, small d, is that? We have at least 3 folks already indicated they're ready to speak in the chat box. Others who would like to, please indicate as so in the chat box. We'll definitely bring you into this conversation. I'd like to first call on Dr. Nina, who is on the call right now. I understand have a cat in the background, but we'd still love to hear your voice. After that, let's take Brian and then Rachel. Let's take 3 at once so that we can bring in a diversity of voices before we kick things back to Mike and Mark. And then we'll take another round of questions, and maybe if we have time, one more round after that. So please do indicate, folks, if you like to share in the chat box, and we will relay your question or have you relay it yourself. Dr. Nina?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. I've never actually done this before. I'm actually projecting onto my TV with the laptop next to it. So I'm like, well, I've never done this before. Because normally I just want to watch at this late hour. My question for Professor Lansing is, part of the way that you described the Nonpartisan League, particularly the membership base, and being very platform organized and using that platform to support candidates, sounds very similar to organizations like the League of Women Voters, Sierra Club, those kinds of organizations. And yet they don't seem to be as successful in terms of political influence. And so I'm curious how you might explain that lack of influence that we see in other organizations that seem to have similar characteristics.
Great, thanks for that. And so let's take the notes down there, Mike and Mark, and we'll have 3 questions for you here. Brian next, and then Rachel.
Okay, thank you. This is Brian. Yeah, this is more of a comment, but I guess it deserves, further discussion and that sort of thing. But when it was mentioned earlier about some of the ideas about people having difficulties getting their heads around, progressive ideas or institutions coming out of North Dakota, having been a former resident of there and that sort of thing, I think in part it comes from just the conventional wisdom that's permeated throughout this country, like through the conventional media, that these areas of the country, like the great center of the country, is inherently conservative, especially today. In some ways, that's absolutely true. But on the other hand, I think that it works at the disadvantage to progressives who are trying to organize simply because that's not the case. And having been a resident in North Dakota and far western Kansas and southeast Ohio, those are all areas that are seen as conservative. In the case of Southwest Ohio, it's white and racist, and Appalachia isn't white and racist necessarily, and that sort of thing. And so I think it's important that as we're working with people and stuff, we also project a healthy skepticism of what we're saying, and also what media says about these areas, because it isn't necessarily true. There's lots of good ideas and good people and that sort of thing. I live in Cleveland right now, and it's a Democratic stronghold that also has all its liabilities with all this great Democratic leadership.
Thanks, Brian. We'll add one more to that already rich stack here. Rachel.
Hey, I'm curious to hear you talk about the relationship between like the gradual redefinition of class by like cultural signifiers rather than just like people's actual material conditions, and sort of how that has affected the right, the claiming and co-opting populism, and sort of the barriers that poses to solidarity between like working classes from like different cultural backgrounds.
Great. I think a group of related questions, each with their own depth. Mark?
Well, I mean, can we start with Nina's question? I mean, all three of them are great.
Sure, do it.
Okay, excellent. So it is true that there are these organizations out there that are membership based and have platforms like the Sierra Club or the League of Women's Voters. The League of Women's Voters, of course, from the 1920s in the wake of the 19th Amendment's passage. And leagues, that term was very popular in the early 20th century in the United States. It was kind of part and parcel of America's associational culture, in which citizens found themselves organizing into these entities that were otherwise hard to describe. They're a league of this or the league of that. Sometimes they were informal politics and sometimes not. The League of Women's Voters, of course, does not take policy stances, right? It focuses on much more on the process. Sierra Club has its own long history as an organization, very much rooted in the Bay Area until the 1950s, and as much of an outdoors club as any kind of political advocacy group. But even today, I would argue it's largely a political advocacy group. And what I'm describing is something different. I'm describing a formal entity in formal electoral politics. And this is not just about a platform and endorsement. This is about literally delivering a voting block. This is about expressly being part and parcel of the electoral political conversation in the way that a third party might, and yet not being a party. Once again, think about a cooperative, but a cooperative operating as a political party might. I think that's a fundamental difference, because the membership-based and the platform-oriented politics is exactly that. It's exactly focused on electoral politics. Even as all this day-to-day, everyday democracy stuff is happening, they want to win elections. That's what they're focused on. And the Sierra Club, I would argue, is focused more on policy and the law. I mean, that's a turn in the 1970s, where they become deeply vested in investing a lot of membership money in legal battles and with lawyers and lobbyists. And so they've been swept up into this kind of lobbying culture in the Beltway, where the League remains citizen organized because internally it's structured in such a way where you have the members themselves meeting in little farmhouses, little schoolhouses, and then choosing whom they're going to send to the larger gatherings and conventions, and who's going to select their statewide candidates. And then once again, statewide, local, not national.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
And I think, yeah, I would follow up, and I'm going to leave most of this discussion to you, Michael, but I think your framing of organizing versus mobilizing is very true here, right? And the upper Midwest caucus tradition of politics, where the it's a vestige at the moment. I don't know that our platform suggestions ever really survived, because I lived in a very lefty neighborhood that would pass things that were kind of wonderfully crazy. But it's still there, where at least the idea that the grassroots creates the platform. It's not that experts create a platform and hand it down to the voters, which feels to me sort of like the Sierra Club model. I'm asking experts to work on legal issues, and I'm going to support their work as a professional cadre. But the League and this sort of small d tradition is very much that the platform is generated by the membership themselves. It's not a subscription model, it's an active member model. That seems to me to be the power of the League and some of the farmer labor movement in its early days.
Yeah, and in fact, when League leaders who, by the rules, could not run as political candidates, when League leaders and organizers started adding things to the platform, it actually submarined the organization. When they started changing things and trying out some other stuff, in some cases, the membership was just like, yeah, that's not what we're in this for. So it's very much a grassroots definition of the mission that's constantly changing with the circumstances, as Mark suggests. But that's a great question.
All right, so bringing it back, right, we have two other questions, kind of linked questions in some ways from different angles. Yeah, Mike, from Brian and from Rachel.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to take on Rachel's excellent question first, if I could. This shift of understanding class in terms of cultural signifiers, I think that's really important as it relates to the ways in which the right lays claim to populism. In other words, it's not just the ways in which the word is used and deployed, although the word itself has become a cultural signifier, one could argue. The middle class itself has also changed. So the middle class of the Nonpartisan League of the early 1900s is small property, small business, if they're in an urban situation, anti-monopolistic. And what it means to be middle class after the 1930s is something different. It means that you either own or aspire to own a single family home. It means that you imagine yourself as a professional, which in and of itself is a form of separation from a broader group of people. And then it's manifested in various forms of consumption, everything from access to a four-year degree to what kind of car you drive. And that shift in the middle class, which is both material and cultural, I think made it much harder for this kind of working class, middle class coalition to emerge in that post-war period. And in fact, the other piece of that is anti-communism, right? Anti-communism not only destroyed the CP and other left movements, or largely drove them underground in the late 40s and early 1950s, or frankly, starting in the late 1930s, it actually also undid much of the small producer tradition in the upper Midwest in particular. A really significant organization in the 30s and 40s, the Farmers Union, that kind of picked up where the League left off. They got red baited like crazy, right? The Farmer Holiday Association in the 1930s in Iowa, red baited. In the 30s, the senator from South Dakota, Carl Mundt, was Joseph McCarthy's right-hand person in the Senate in the early 1950s. He'd been red baiting for over a decade in the Dakotas. So I think it's also important so we can talk about the shifts in what it means to be middle class, which are both material and cultural. And then I think the thing that I didn't talk about, which is this anti-communism, which itself becomes cultural. Like if we want to talk about culture in a broader way, it becomes a crucial part, in fact, of a way we might answer Brian's question. And that is that one of the reasons on election night, you look and you see red North Dakota and red South Dakota and red Iowa. First of all, I mean, I just love the irony of red being associated with the GOP. I mean, I assume I'm not the only one. Please tell me I'm not the only one laughing at the television every time I see it. I just can't get over it. Yeah, okay, thank you. I can't get over it. And that is that there's this shift. There's a anti-monopoly politics in the upper Midwest. It's very powerful before World War II. There's a anti-militarism politics that's very powerful. So powerful it starts to blend into, it starts to extend little connections to anti-Semitism in the American First Movement. Even though the Catholic and Protestant people living in the Dakotas or Minnesota were no more anti-Semitic than anybody you might find in New York or Boston. They were just as, but no more. That tradition of anti-militarism, that tradition of anti-monopolism is transformed after the war. It's transformed after the war because of anti-communism. It's transformed after the war because of the military-industrial complex. There are huge Air Force bases in Rapid City, South Dakota, Minot, North Dakota, Grand Forks, North Dakota. And those military bases bring thousands of military personnel every year, many of whom, not all of whom, but many of them bring particular cultural and political understandings with them that historians are saying actually transformed that space in the 50s and 60s. Brian might want to remind us that, you know, there was this guy named George McGovern. I know Mark was interested in talking about this, but there's this guy named George McGovern who was this very liberal Democratic senator, US senator from the state of South Dakota. It's him and Joseph McCarthy's right-hand person serving side by side in the Senate for South Dakota in the 1960s, right? And you might go like, what? McGovern's connected to this older tradition of anti-militarism, this older tradition of anti-monopolism. Very churchy. McGovern's, you know, not only has a PhD in American history, but is also, you know, Methodist, deeply Methodist. And by 1980, when McGovern is voted out of office, he can't understand what's happened in South Dakota. But what's happened is that older pre-war tradition has largely been snuffed out. That said, as Brian points out, there are plenty of folks that we could be building coalitions with in rural parts of the United States, not just in the upper Midwest. I think of Indian country, for instance. As soon as you get west of the Mississippi, there are big swaths of rural parts of the West that are American Indian nations. Very important to remember. Some people argue that, you know, the 70s kind of youth counterculture fled these rural areas, including in the Dakotas. You can make an argument for that, but there are still little pockets that you start to build out from potentially. And I think it's finally really important to remember that we are kind of obsessed with this rural-urban split right now. Our political discourse and our popular discourse is all focused on it. But in fact, there was this great article in the Washington Post yesterday. And it basically, let me pull it up. I'll read the headline. I won't share the screen. Basically, the article says the 11 largest metropolitan areas in the US gave Trump more total votes than all of rural America combined. 14% of Americans lived in rural counties as of 2018. In other words, the depopulation of rural America, the fact that there aren't really small farmers anymore, certainly has had an effect on rural politics in America, no question. But I mean, there are just as many urban and suburban voters for Trump. In fact, there are more in the cities and suburbs. That kind of challenges how we frame things in these conversations, I would argue. And it challenges us to think about the possibilities of coalition work in all these rural parts of the country.
Thanks, Mike. Really interesting. In a way, I mean, I was thinking your last comment, it's almost like you can't, there's a tendency in some circles to kind of blame Trump on people who live in the countryside. But really, we should be blaming perhaps the aristocratic, anti-democratic electoral college, right? For the way it grants electoral votes based on based on space, based on things very other than population, not just the people who live there, right? I mean, there's a kind of slippage there, which seems to be very important. We have a couple more questions, and I'd love to hear more about your thoughts. My own question, I'll slip in the stack, is to hear you say a little more about the possibilities for organizing in so-called red states. I still think I'd like to hear a little more and lessons from the Nonpartisan League on that front. So we had a couple questions in the chat box. One is from Joseph Nevins, a regular and sometimes a guest actually on Shelter in Solidarity. Joe, I see your microphone seems to be working tonight. Joe, could you ask your question? After that, we will have, if he so chooses, we have Seren Mudliar, our co-producer, who has, I believe, a question for us as well. And we welcome additional questions from the chat box. From anyone else who has not yet spoken, excuse me. Take it away, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Let me start by thanking Mark for that beautiful song. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Michael, for a really fascinating and stimulating presentation. You talked about the state-owned enterprises as a third rail of North Dakota politics. Please help us make sense of this in terms of how it aids our understanding of the conservative / right-wing components of North Dakota's political landscape. So does that third rail contribute to the right in some ways? And or what are the openings that it might provide for broadening a populist with a capital P, politics in the Dakotas?
Great. Seren, if you are, I know Seren is multitasking as he often is as our stalwart producer. Seren, I know you had a couple questions. Could you maybe give us one of them before we bring it back to Mike and Mark?
Actually, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead with my questions. The first question, kind of a throwaway question. We talk about small d democracy, and yet socialism seems to have gained currency, certainly among young people, and one that that powered at least one of the insurgent candidacies within the Democratic Party. Why not socialism? What would be the difference between socialism and small d democracy? I imagine you'd want to explore the property question. My second question is probably a bit more complicated. How is it that populism, which often promises to simplify politics, how would that be suitable to today's real lived experience, given the complexity of the working class and the idea that we would need to have caucuses and all sorts of coalition kinds of politics, and therefore negotiation and perhaps even less transparency in order to build a broader working class movement? So my question is, how suited is a populist model, a populist aspiration to the complexity of building a united or a multiracial and diverse working class movement?
Great. Thanks, Seren. Thanks, Joe. I think that's plenty for Mike and Mark to respond to, I believe, right there. So Mike, take it away.
Oh, yeah, these are magical and fantastic and really hard. This is great. Thank you so much for these especially thoughtful questions, all of them. Okay, so state-owned industries in North Dakota as a third rail. So the Nonpartisan League comes into power in 1918. They have to change the state constitution in order to create the state industries. They do so. They argue that case all the way to the Supreme Court. They win. So that's now enshrined in federal jurisprudence that you can have state-owned industries, because that was an open question legally before that point. And then right as they start building the mill and elevator, and as they're organizing the bank, they get recalled. And their opponents, who were also a nonpartisan organization of a coalition of disgruntled leaguers and establishment politicians, come together, and they kick the leaguers out of power at the State House in Bismarck. And then they continue building the mill and elevator, and they actually organize the bank to be more thoroughly professional. So the very opponents of the league at the moment continued with their state-owned industries program. And the reason that they did so was because it was clear that an overwhelming majority of the population of the state wanted it to happen. And that relates to today and the possibilities for organizing the Dakotas today, because Republicans and Democrats in North Dakota alike support those state-owned industries. The state bank largely is not a consumer bank. It largely supports small banks around the state. So you can start to imagine how a Republican could cozy up to that. They do offer some incredible student loan programs for state residents, which is one of the reasons people are so excited about municipal and state banking. That said, North Dakotans understand the state-owned industries as egalitarian. Most of us from the outside would understand them as socialist. And there are even some upper Midwesterners who love to romanticize a more radical past, a more radical rural life, And they like to refer to the state industries as socialist. But North Dakotans understand them as egalitarian. And that egalitarianism runs deep even today. So there was a constitutional amendment in North Dakota a couple of years ago protecting small town drugstores from the big drugstore chains. The voters voted it. They supported it. They wanted to protect small town drugstores. It was like this weird ember of small property, democratic politics, lower middle class politics that kind of suddenly was like, whoa. I was staying with my aunt in Bismarck and she told me about it. I was like, what are you talking about, right? This is a Republican state. The people there must just, like want all the big chains to come in. But they actually have this commitment to egalitarianism. There was a fight against parking meters in the state of North Dakota in the 1950s. You won't find a parking meter in the state of North Dakota because it's seen as unfair. It's seen as not egalitarian. So this notion of egalitarianism is actually the way in, I would argue. It's the way in to having any kind of conversation outside of organized labor or the 30% of state residents who consistently vote for the Democratic Party there.
Thank you, Mike. Did you want to, I mean, in some ways you addressed, I think, all the questions that were put forth, but actually Soren's last one about the possible limits or possibility of populism as a framework for a terrain of great political and social complexity and diversity. I don't know if you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I would say is that once you start digging into this tradition in American life, which runs through the country's history and is iterated in all these varied ways, you see that, of course, the tradition is very complicated. That's the first thing I'll say. And anyone who tells you that this is a simplistic way to solve things is wrong. The second thing I would say is that we have examples of how to think along these lines of coalition. And here I'm thinking about Bayard Rustin in the late 1960s, both right before and then after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Rustin, of course, along with A. Philip Randolph, they outline a freedom budget. They basically argue that the future of progress for the African American community in America is tied to industrial unionism. And they lay out an even better version of the Great Society. It's called the Freedom Budget. You can find it online. It's fantastic. It's fascinating. It's a road not taken. Of course, in African American communities, you see ongoing work in the Black church. You see the emergence of Black power movements, and you see the emergence in the early 70s of Black capitalism, right? Bayard Rustin in 1971 writes another essay called Blacks in the Unions. It's fascinating reading, because what they're doing is, in that kind of Black Marxist tradition, they're seeing how capitalism is racial capitalism, right? And I think a socialist feminist would tell us, of course, that it's also profoundly gendered and sexualized. And we see that, as Cedric Robinson said a long time ago, that racism and capitalism are born at the same time, and they're so thoroughly interwoven. And Rustin is one of the people who comes up with this way of thinking about building coalitions across difference around shared self-interest. The Freedom Budget is a perfect representation of that, and it's deliberately targeted towards electoral formal party politics. And it's largely forgotten. So I would encourage folks, that's how I would answer that question, is that it is complicated. And we actually do have some examples of bringing together coalitions across class and across race. Some ideas, some proposals from some really smart, dedicated folks who thought about a lot and had a lot of experience. And it might be worth turning back, for instance, to the late Rustin, just like we talk about the different Martin Luther King Jr.'s, right? Where he ends with talking about militarism and poverty and racism is all deeply intertwined in a way that he knew in the 1950s, but it wasn't fully articulating in the movement. Bayard Rustin, of course, has a trajectory too. And the late Bayard Rustin is well worth pursuing, especially along the lines that you're suggesting.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I mean, I'm very, you're reminding me also of Thomas Frank's book. He has that chapter on kind of Black populism. He kind of reframes particularly the late Martin Luther King as kind of in relationship to the populist precedent in the populist movement, kind of and Rustin as well, right? Figure there too. And again, it's kind of startling. You don't expect, if you, based on the rhetoric many of us have internalized over the years, you don't expect to see that in a book on populism sometimes because of the racialized, kind of reframing and appropriation of that term. But it's so important, and I appreciate you kind of, as we move towards an end to this show today. We'll give you a final word in a moment, Mike, as well, and Mark too, if he wants to. Not seeing any other pressing, urgent questions in the chat box, and cognizant we're over 90 minutes here. I just want to offer, again, thanks to Michael Lansing for being here, and for Mark Soderstrom for leading the hosting tonight, and to all of you for your comments and questions. I like that term egalitarian, egalitarian and ecumenical. I think two things that we need to bring back. I mean, one thing I learned listening to you tonight, Mike, and what makes me want to read more of your work is the way in which a political space, a region, a political mobilization can look it seems like it can look very distant or very different up close than from a distance, right? And the importance, as you say, of finding a way into actual sustained engagement and organizing with people. And I think that we should reflect on the language we use in that context. I would unite with that. We again, Shelter in Solidarity is here every every 2 weeks from now on, twice a month. December 3rd will be our next show, as we take on the theme Arts and Resistance with some great slam poets and likely some musicians and visual artists as well. Demetrius Noble, Raymond Nat Turner, and others. Check us out on YouTube. Subscribe, please. Spread the word. Our website is shelterinsolidarity.org. You can find us on Facebook. Follow us, share the content, make suggestions. Perhaps you can be a guest or a musical interlude. Dean Stevens is on the call, has provided us music in the past and will in the future. Mark has shown his musical colors, and we'd love to host your voice as well. Mike, I'll give you a final word if you'd like one to wrap up the show, and Mark as well. And then we will ask folks to see us in 2 weeks. Mike, final word?
I just want to thank everybody for being here, for being interested in something that might be more or less familiar to you. And I think that as we continue to face these overlapping crises, I just want to return to where we started. We have to think in lots of different kinds of ways. We need to be exposed to many different ideological orientations on the left, many different sets of commitments. And I think that there is incredibly fruitful stuff that comes from those kinds of intersections. So I just want to thank you all for being here and for providing a space for exactly that kind of conversation.
Thank you, Mike. Mark?
I would just like to take the moment to thank Michael for his very generous gift of his time and sharing with us. It's been such a pleasure. And when COVID ends, I hope that Mike and I can continue a long-standing Minneapolis breakfast tradition that has been interrupted. It's wonderful to see him here at Shelter in Solidarity. And really to thank Joe and the other producers for opening the space for this conversation. Thank you all very much.
Yes, and thanks to you, Mark, and thanks to name those other producers. We have Tim Sheard, Linda Liu, Seren Mudliar, Mark himself, Kira Mudliar. We have our supporters and our sponsors at Hardball Press, a publisher of working class stories, including a new nurse book on nursing, which is an organizing nurses, which everyone should check out. That's Hardball Press. The journal Socialism and Democracy, of which a couple of us are on the editorial board. This is a peer-edited research journal for social movement activists and studying of social movements. Socialism and Democracy, sdonline.org. And also Encuentro Cinco, known affectionately here in Boston as E5, a hub for progressive. And I'm going to maybe I'll stop using the term progressive. I don't know, after this show, it starts saying populist. I don't know, but I don't want to say that it's a progressive. And for now, I'm going to say progressive organizing in downtown Boston, social justice movements. And in addition to that, we have the Community Church of Boston, our newest co-sponsor, represented here tonight and often musically by Dean Stevens. If you'd like to co-sponsor the show, if you'd like to get involved, help us to amplify this project of building community conversation, please be in touch, shelterandsolidarity.org. Thank you all for being here tonight, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Until then, be safe. And as we say here on the show, stay safe, stay engaged, and stay together. Shelter and solidarity. See you next time.